and welcome to WooStream, bringing Willamette to you. Today's conversation features Andrew Kach, Associate Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management at Willamette University's Atkinson Graduate School of Management. Prior to Willamette, Andrew was a senior researcher and lecturer at the Swiss Federal Institute's Chair of Logistics Management. Professor Kach will be discussing the various societal and environmental forces that affect our modern global economy's supply chains, including modern slavery and forced labor practices, as well as the impacts of COVID and other natural and man-made disasters. We tend not to think about supply chains until the shelves are empty or Amazon doesn't have something we need. So this will be an interesting look at this vital but often overlooked topic. Professor Kach, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tiffany. Pleasure is all mine. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us. And I'm thinking, today's session really, it came to mind, could I present something or should I present something that's more research-oriented? And instead, I decided to really take all the extent research that I'm working on and synthesize it and discuss really the topic that I work on, which is sustainable supply chain management, and looking predominantly at risk throughout supply chains pertaining to different types of environmental, social, and governance-related risk. And so I have a slide deck. I'll share the slide deck. I don't know how far through it we're going to get. I put together some slides. I think we could probably just spend this entire time on the first 3 or 4 or 5. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen. I'll pull this up. And so I titled this Supply-Related Legitimacy Spillovers, How Sustainability Grievances Hurt Business Partners. And really what I would like to focus on is disentangling what are sustainability-related supply chain risks? What do they mean? What do they entail? How do they manifest themselves? And then how do managers react? Right? And we're talking about managers, maybe looking predominantly at purchasing officers, supply chain directors, and that's really the intersection of my research. So a lot of what I do is work on understanding and disentangling what we consider to be maybe some of the trigger mechanisms behind these specific risks. So one of our papers right now is looking at modern slavery and trying to understand, what is the perceptions of managers regarding modern slavery and extent supply chains? What are some of the critical issues that come forward? How do they manage and deal with those issues when they arise? And the short answer to that is it's incredibly challenging, and many of them don't necessarily have strategies in place that are positioned specifically to deal with those risks contingent upon how they manifest. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. What is a sustainability-related risk? What's a traditional risk? And then try to tie this all into COVID, because I know part of this is thinking about, well, we're in the midst of this pandemic and there have been major supply chain risks and implications. But one thing that hasn't been pinned down by scholars or managers yet really is, what kind of risk is this? Right? Because initially it really took the shape of a more traditional supply chain risk, right? There were bottlenecks, backlogs, shortages, major supply issues, sales and operations planning, pitfalls, supplier stockouts. The bullwhip effect, for those of you that have played the beer game or something similar, was rampant, right? We saw major bullwhip effects contingent upon the length of the supply chain. But then other interesting risks manifested, right? So it wasn't just the traditional risks. It was also, for example, risks of exposure. In our campus in particular, right? There were concerns about reopening, students being exposed to COVID. And this is not necessarily a traditional risk. This was more of a stakeholder reaction in terms of, hey, I don't know if this is a good idea. I might withdraw my funding. I might not be happy if this occurs. And so we've seen COVID really sort of have a level of plasticity. It sort of shifts between a traditional risk and a sustainable risk and back and forth, and really can't make up its mind what it is at any given time. And so we see this dual manifestation or this kind of quasi element to it. And so what I'm going to do is talk about traditional risks, zoom in more predominantly on sustainable risks, and then tail end the conversation with, well, where do we go from here, right? So COVID maybe takes on elements of both of these risks. How do we deal with it? What do we do? What did some firms react appropriately? Did some firms overreact? Did some firms underreact? And then at the end, I'd love to take questions regarding anything. Any of this really. So this is an example. I removed the identifying information. I thought in case anybody is working with or at this firm, it's probably best not to identify the CEO or the respondent. However, the respondent did wish to remain anonymous. But this is a direct quote from a CEO that talks about really business growing and scaling and complexity, which is absolutely true, taking on more suppliers, building out the supply base and the extent supply network. Also at the same time, trying to ramp up transparency and accountability. Now on paper, this is a very nice statement. And I'm not saying that this statement is not true, but what's interesting is given the level of complexity throughout our extent supply chains, there's always going to be something somewhere. And so, for example, right now we have a paper that we're working on, we're getting ready to resubmit, and we have about 42 chief purchasing officers, directors, CEOs, and CPOs that we've interviewed. And many of them have told us in confidence, so again, I can't reveal who they are, and this is not one of them. This was not someone we interviewed, so this is not part of the research study. Was that their response was, we know that somewhere in our 4,000, 5,000, 8,000, supplier network, that there's probably some case of modern slavery. There's probably some case of an environmental issue. We don't know where it is. It's hard to pin it down. It's difficult to know. And even if we could have accountability for all 8,000 of our suppliers, that's at the supply base level. There's also the second tier, the third tier, the fourth tier. There's absolutely something going on there, and we don't have transparency. We can't see who all those suppliers are. These posit major challenges. So of course, going out, we see reactions from suppliers where there are employees who say, look, we're powerless. We don't have any means to make any change in this system, right? And so we've seen multiple cases of this where there are these sustainable supply chain grievances at the supplier locations where there's exploitation of labor, the workforce, et cetera, environmental issues, governance issues. And I'll get into greater detail of what those exactly entail here in a few slides. But just to say that a great extent of our research is looking at the perceptions, right? And we know that perception in a great sense is reality on the side of the businesses, or the buyers, I should say, and then talking to suppliers and seeing where they're position in terms of what's going on at their location or what's going on at their supplier's location. So really, in terms of the introduction to this, we know this is of great importance, right? Increasingly over the years, buying firms are being held more and more accountable for sustainability related issues emerging upstream. And there's a plethora of research. I won't get into it. I won't go into the nitty gritty details of all these papers, so don't worry, but there's a plethora of sustainability related research detailing and documenting this. What we also know is that incidents have escalated quite heavily, quite substantively. And this is important because the real trigger mechanism, the real medium here for engaging in sustainability related risks or engaging stakeholders is media reporting. And so when the media latches onto an issue and they broadcast it, whether it's a mainstream media channel, a blog, a website, whatever it is, these mediums allow for information to be transferred, and then stakeholders have access to it and they can react. Because otherwise, most of us don't know what's going on with supplier X in Shenzhen in China unless we're there on the ground or we're working directly with that supplier. So it's very hard to obtain information regarding many of these particular suppliers. And so once the media reports, that's really the major trigger medium to then create a reaction within the system. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about really what are these risks and how are they differentiated. And hopefully we get beyond this, but this might be as far as we get. I apologize. I was just thinking, how can I give this presentation best to provide information, but not really dredge into data and looking at, all the fun quantitative content. And actually, most of my research is qualitative, so it's all interview data, which can be interesting. But, again, interesting to me. I don't know about to everyone else. So really, we have two kinds of major risks here: our traditional supply chain risks and our sustainability-related supply chain risks. And the way I've bucketed this is on one side, we have sustainability unrelated supply chain risks. These are traditional risks. This is, let's say a natural disaster occurs and operations are shut down. That's a traditional risk. A truck tips over, there's an issue in delivery or transportation. You receive an incomplete shipment, incomplete order. You receive a shipment and there's a quality issue, right? These are all traditional risks. And even on the receiving end, even at the supplier location, you may have a financially distressed supplier. Right? We know in the automotive industry, at least 1/3 of suppliers, more like 2/3 of suppliers in the automotive industry are financially distressed, right? Because there's great pressure to deliver. There's a huge onboarding cost in terms of ramping up production. And a lot of times in the sales and operations planning process, those automotive suppliers are ramped up 2 years to 5 years in advance. There's huge, major upfront investments, and then many of them become distressed financially over some period of time before there's deliverables and payouts. And so that's another issue. And then it could also be an overcapacity or overpromise on the supplier's part, which is where we'll get into COVID and seeing where some of those risks occurred in terms of supplier capacity and constraints. On the other side, we have supply chain sustainability unrelated risks within the system. So these are not related to supply chain. These are just sustainability related risks. So this could be something at your own location, dealing with your own production, your own operations, maybe the CO2, your own carbon footprint, your emissions, the way you treat your workforce. This is you as the buying firm or you as a principal firm. These are sustainability issues within your own firm. And right in the middle, that's my research area, that little tiny area in the middle, that's my focus. Actually, it's more specific than that, is supply chain sustainability risks. So this is now a supplier who is engaging in some kind of or some level of unsustainable behavior or activity. And that can be at the supply base, direct relationship buyer-supplier, or it can be at the second, third, fourth, fifth, nth tier level in terms of the supply system or supply network. And those can trickle down, right? So a good example there is, and I use this in my classroom, so I apologize if any of my former students are here and they've heard this before, but cobalt sourcing from the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? The DRC supplies circa 55 to 60% of the world's cobalt, and much of that cobalt is used in semiconductors and used in electronic devices, particularly in the automotive industry and also cell phones. So if you have one of these, and most firms do not have conflict mineral traceability. Some do, like Intel. Many others don't or haven't launched those kinds of traceability systems, and so they're not necessarily sure where that cobalt comes from. And much of the cobalt mining in the DRC is slave labor, unsafe conditions, child labor, really, really poor working conditions. But for many of these firms, this is a fifth tier supplier, right? So we're going through multiple layers of suppliers before we get to the DRC and the actual mining companies and the laborers themselves. So it can be this far out, it could be this close, doesn't matter. You can still get criticized and punished for those levels of supply chain sustainability related risks. So looking at those, there's two kinds of supply chain risks, but they differ fundamentally. And this is the key critical point. This is where it becomes really interesting. And this is where I want to sort of disentangle COVID and look at sort of the bifurcation process. So if it's a traditional, I should have just called it traditional, but a sustainability unrelated, what happens is there's a risk source. So you know somewhere in your supply network, your supply chain, there's a risk source. There's great risk platforms for identifying this. Resilink is one of them. You can look at all your suppliers. You can look at locations. You can look at transportation, shipment schedules, deliveries, capacity, you name it. And then there's some kind of disruption. That actual physical disruption leads to a negative impact. And again, that could be a late delivery, a quality issue, a truck tipping over, a natural disaster. These are traditional risks. Sustainability related risks are a little bit different. They occur when there is a stakeholder reaction. So if stakeholders do not react, then that risk does not manifest into disruption, right? And that's the interesting part here. So that means there could be a supplier somewhere in the world dumping pollutants into a lake or abusing their workforce or engaging in slave labor practices. And if stakeholders are not reacting and punishing that supplier, there's no negative effect. And it's kind of heartbreaking, right? Because there's all these suppliers around the world that may be engaging in this behavior, but until stakeholders react, that's the trigger mechanism. There's no negative effect, particularly on the buying firm. And this can occur even when the supplier is engaging perfectly in legal activity. So that doesn't mean your supplier is breaking the rules. They may be, but they may not be. Right? So we actually have a paper we published in Journal of Business Logistics in 2016, on what we call paradoxical risks, which is a sustainability risk where your supplier is doing everything legal in their local context. They're not breaking their own laws, their own rules, but your buying firm, predominantly in a Western country, sees that as, hey, that's not cool. That's not okay to make your workforce stand on their feet for 16 hours, work in hot, sweaty conditions, to let them live in these shanties and pay them 30 euros a month, right? But that might all be legal but then the Western firms come in and they still might hold that buying firm responsible. But until those stakeholders react, we don't see any negative effect predominantly on the buying firm. And so this is really that intersection, and that interesting part about sustainability related risks is stakeholders have to react. And you're probably wondering, maybe, who are these stakeholders? Well, it can be almost anybody involved in any activity, or it comes into any contact with this firm. So it could be an end user or a consumer, someone buying the product, or someone that's purchasing the product in another firm. It could be outside forces like the media, could be a blogger, it could be a website, right? There's entire websites dedicated to sort of harassing McDonald's, right? I mean, really, there are websites just dedicated to calling McDonald's out on their unsustainable behavior. And arguably rightly so. They're one of the top 10 most criticized firms in the world. You can look all this up. I have all the data on this in terms of media reporting that I got from a firm in Switzerland. It's pretty cool. I mean, it's not cool what's happening, but the data is quite rich. Or it can be internal stakeholders. So if you remember when the Foxconn incidents were occurring with Apple, right, in the early 2010s, 2011, 2014, 15, there were internal employees or executives that actually quit because they were upset about what was going on. They said, this isn't right. What's happening here with Foxconn, with our supplier, is not right. And so they actually quit. And so it can even be internal workforce that sees your actions as a buying firm and says, I don't agree with this. This is not okay what's happening. So a stakeholder can, again, be internal or external to the firm in terms of this process. So that's the differentiation between a traditional risk and a sustainability related risk. And the reason I wanted to disentangle this is that COVID kind of flip-flops between both of these, right? When COVID first hit, it really was this manifestation of, hey, there's a potential pandemic. What do we do? Especially if I'm Clorox or I'm a firm that's making major decisions regarding, or if I am, manufacturing toilet paper or any kinds of these disinfectant wipes or et cetera. I have to think about, well, what's going to happen to the market? Who is my market? What does that look like? What's the uptick going to be? And I can get more into that here later, and then make decisions regarding those supply channels and that delivery. So that's a bit more of a traditional risk when maybe there's a bottleneck with the suppliers. Maybe they can't deliver on time. Maybe your competitors beat you to some of your suppliers because they don't have solidarity in their contracting, and they've taken up a bit of their capacity before you could get a foot in the door. And so there's all sorts of risks that can creep in. Those are more traditional. But there's still that sustainability complex because this is a bit of a social risk, right? There's governance and social aspects here. And there's also an environmental aspect too. If you see all the issues now with the masks that are washing up on the shorelines, right? We've sold all these disposable masks, and now we're finding them on beaches and we're finding them in landfills because of these disposables that have created additional waste due to this, this risk, right? Which has become now somewhat of a sustainability related risk. It's also interesting in what happened governance wise, right? There were laws and regulations passed environmentally dealing with certain sustainable practices that were rolled back when COVID hit. So even here locally, right, we had this plastic bag ban. And as soon as COVID hit, the plastic bag ban just kind of dissipated. And all of a sudden you can get these plastic bags again because, COVID's here, so we're going to let our downstream retailers off the hook. And other environmental issues that have been backslid a little bit or reduced in terms of or in light of this recent pandemic, which is interesting, especially if this is sort of the quote unquote new norm. If that's the quote unquote new norm, then we better think pretty quickly about these rolled back environmental issues, because we need to decide, is that going to be a permanent change or where is it going to go from here? And I'm not saying I have the answer to that. I'm just saying that's something that happened in response to this issue, which is why it's a traditional supply chain risk, but it's also sustainability related. So again, that plasticity of working between both environments, which makes it fundamentally different than anything we've seen before. So I can tell you, scholarship and research has really not focused, from my knowledge in this field, on anything that takes on both forms. So unless something's been published extremely recently and I missed it, no one has looked at any risk that's both traditional and sustainable at the same time and how that has an impact, particularly on purchasing and managerial decision making. right? Which many of you, if you're in here and you're a purchasing officer, if you're in procurement, if you're a manager and you're thinking, well, great, that sounds terrible. Like, what do I do? How do I deal with this? How do I navigate this? I have some things that might help, and I'll share some of that with you here by getting off of this slide and moving forward. And again, I'll move through some of my slides a little bit quickly, but I wanted to spend time on this one particularly because I think that's really kind of the crux here in terms of understanding this. So really quickly, in terms of sustainability, oftentimes we discuss this as environmental, social, and governance related. Just to tease this out quickly for those of you who might be wondering, well, what does that mean? Excuse me. I think environmental is fairly straightforward, so I won't spend a lot of time there. Any kind of damages or impact on ecosystems, waste, animal mistreatment, landscapes, etc., deforestation, unsafe, mining, fracking, things like that that create negative outputs on the environment or negative effects on the environment. Social is a bit more complex. Social, we believe, contains three major buckets. One is disruptive, which is disruptive bleeds a little bit into governance, which is labor strikes, protests, workers that are not happy with their current working situations or the status quo. Human rights violations, this is predominantly where my research resides, is just on that bucket, right? Looking at poor employment conditions, human rights abuses, complicity, modern slavery, wage theft, wage violations, folks, engaging in all sorts of real micro transactions and micro aggressions here as well. There's a huge plethora, and it becomes very complex. And that's why it's difficult for managers to navigate this one sometimes. And then physical consequences, which could be health issues, deaths, injuries, suicides, etc. And then, of course, governance is really just financial and legal. So legal consequences for suppliers and also financial fines and settlements. And so the way this usually manifests, if we go back to this slide and we think about sustainability-related supply chain issues, is you have your supplier here, right? And I could draw on the screen. I won't. You probably might be able to see my mouse floating around here. If you can, that'll probably be sufficient. You have the supplier here, and there's some environmental, social, governance-related issue. And when this occurs, hopefully the media latches onto it and they receive some level of information. And there's also investors who are anticipating a level of risk. This is where it gets interesting, right? You have investors who are thinking about this risk because they are managing a portfolio of assets and they're trying to gain some arbitrage in the markets. Actually, the firm that we have all of our media data from was initially for many years selling that data to investors. And after about 7 years, they decided, hey, maybe we should take all this sustainability data and give it to folks for research, because they were using it and selling it and making they still do quite a profit to investors who are using it to gain arbitrage in the markets. I'm not criticizing them for that. I'm just saying it's interesting that they have this rich, vast, munificent data and then decided, oh, you know what? Yeah, they opened it up, which we appreciate. If anyone from that firm is listening, we really do. It's just, really interesting to have that level of data. So the media, right, who's a more dormant stakeholder, and I won't get into the stakeholder theory here and talking about power and legitimacy and all that fun stuff, but they inform consumers or employees or customers who then have the ability to withhold resources, funding, and sort of punish the buying firm. And this is what a typical manifestation of a risk looks like, right? So you think about, trying to give a good example, Lidl, but that's in Europe. So if you're familiar with Lidl in Europe, Lidl was engaging in sourcing from Bangladesh for garments. They were sourcing from really slave labor, sweatshop type conditions in Bangladesh, garment manufacturers. The media caught wind of this. They aired a documentary in Germany that reached about 7 million people, and 7 million people were not happy with Lidl and basically weren't shopping there anymore for some time. Now, these are not necessarily permanent damages, and I think many managers know that. And so what's interesting is, speaking to managers, there's a challenge here too, because how permanent is some of this, right? How many people, not to call out our local friends here, but at Nike still are huge Nike supporters even after the major 91 to 97 fiasco in child and other underrepresented labor conditions in Indonesia and Pakistan, right? So now they've cleaned that up a bit, but there's still some resurfacing of issues there. But how consumers or stakeholders perceive the firm has a major impact on whether or not they withdraw or withhold resources. So this is that sort of major model there of how that process occurs, right? So similarly with COVID, if you have enough stakeholders, enough of a mass effect, your stakeholders come in and they say, wait a minute, I don't think what you're doing here is safe. I don't think your employees are engaging in safe working conditions based on COVID. I think, or that, your students are able to enter into the classrooms in a safe manner. You could have resources or punishment that occurs from stakeholders because of the way even COVID within your organization is being managed. Or the opposite, right? You have workers who are essential. They have to be there. They have to wake up in the mornings and go somewhere physically. Becomes a major challenge when you tell them, well, here's all these new stipulations and rules. And it's very difficult for them, especially if they have children at home, or if they're a single parent, or if there's other conditions that make it increasingly challenging for them to go to a physical location and work that job now with the new stipulations and rules. So it can go both ways, but it still ends up being a bit of that sort of sustainability related risk rather than a traditional risk from that perspective. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, just to say the market reacts, right? And this is how the market reacts. Stakeholders become aware, there's a liability, and this is the negative spillover we talked about earlier. So there's these negative legitimacy spillovers that can occur. So they see your supplier and they say, well, we can't do much with your supplier because we're not purchasing from your supplier, but we can punish you, right? So you're here in the US, you're exploiting a supplier in another country, or even in your own country, right? That can be local. We're going to withdraw resources, and that's based on that market reaction. The severity is important. It's absolutely important. How severe are these issues, right? So another paper we're working on, we're looking at severity and types to look at when do stakeholders react, right? Because another major issue is, well, okay, if say you have a supplier and there was a minor incident and it was something spilled, or there was a little bit of chemical issue and a few folks got sick, that's still a sustainability related issue, right? There was a hazard, there was maybe a chemical spill or something, and people still were affected negatively by that. But that might not be the same as, say, the Foxconn suicide. I say may not, it is not the same as the way it's perceived, especially, and also the magnitude and the gravitas as the Foxconn suicides, or some of the other, or Bhopal, or some of those other major incidents that have occurred, major chemical spills, Horizon Deepwater platform. I mean, you think about these big ones that have occurred, right? That's not the same as, some chemicals spilled on the floor and a few people were, exposed. It's not good, but it's not the same as destroying millions of hectares of forest or otherwise. So there is a severity, there is a level to which these risks occur. And it, of course, has an impact, right? The higher the severity, I mean, it's a bit tautological, but the higher the severity, the greater the reaction. Pretty straightforward. Media has power. Media wields power. Media loves sensationalism as well. Zwanzig Minuten is still up there. I lived in Switzerland for 4 years, and Zwanzig Minuten is the morning paper. 20 minutes, it's up there. So that's fun to see that again. You'd hop on the tram and there would always be a free copy there. But anyways, these stakeholders, depending on how much reach they have the power to then have an impact on your audience or on the folks within the system, right? So your stakeholders, if it's an online blog and only 50 people, 100 people are reading it, versus if it's CNN or Wall Street Journal, much greater reach, much greater impact. And also in terms of triggering the buying firms to respond to these major issues. And then I won't spend a lot of time on this one. It's probably the most interesting, is the risk index. And different countries have different risk indexes. And based on those risk indexes, that's the level of response that you can expect given those particular issues, right? So if you are in the Western world, if you're in the US or Switzerland or Germany or anywhere in the Western world, or Australia or New Zealand, etc., the risk index is lower, right? The anticipation is lower. So when something happens, stakeholders are much more likely to grab onto that story and react. So if very few buyers, or if really zero buying firms are engaging in suppliers that are using child labor, or let's use the seafood example, right? The Thai fishing boats, where the Thai were using slave labor. They were keeping people in rusty iron cages on these fishing boats in abhorrent conditions. It was really terrible. And it was found out that they were supplying a lot of seafood to the US market and other markets around the world, different buying firms through different subsidiary channels. So in that case, if you're targeted for that, that's pretty bad, right? Because if no one else is doing this, you get hit hard. Whereas if you're in a country where there's an expectation, then it's only bad if you're kind of the worst. So if you're somewhere in the middle or somewhere in the bottom of the pack, you're probably not going to get punished or called out. And we see this all the time, and we call it the umbrella effect to some degree. It's a cover-up of other risks because somebody's doing it, but they're worse, which is incredibly, I think, interesting as a finding in sustainability, is there's so many risks out there, but we can only focus on so many at a time. So really with that anticipation, managers can respond through different channels, through different avenues. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to say managers and buying firms do respond through different types of strategies. But what's interesting, I think, is managers can only focus on so many things at once, right? For those of you that are managers, I've worked as a purchasing officer in procurement, we have this whole plate of suppliers we're working with. And I'm told, you need to look at this risk index, you need to watch for this, you need to watch for this, you need to be careful of late deliveries, you need to be careful of all these different issues and items that we can convert into key performance indicators or metrics. And all of a sudden you have a world that's this big, and then someone says, oh, and then you need to watch out for all these sustainability risks too. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I'll keep my eyes out for some of these, but there's too much going on. And so it's become increasingly challenging for managers to focus on all of these issues at once. And we call that, it's a psychology theory called the cognitive view. And it's the idea that as human beings, we can only focus on and prioritize so much at once, and other things start to fall out into the periphery, right? So I can prioritize 8 things, and then the next 5 are a little further out, the next 5 are even further out. And this is what was reflected in our interviews with managers, is we could see that they were really facing challenges, particularly with modern slavery and social issues, in understanding how those were manifesting and how to deal with those accordingly, right? So we're asking questions, hey, if you discovered this, what would you do? And many managers just kind of looked at us and said, I don't know. I mean, I guess we would cancel the contract, but this is a major supplier, right? So you see at the bottom of this is buyer-supplier dependence. So if there's low dependence and there's high damages or high media impact, it's easy to just avoid it or resource or desource or get rid of the supplier. But as we move on the dependent scale, right, look at Apple, right? Still working with Foxconn. Didn't dump them, right? Because high dependence in terms of that scaling and in terms of the production within the systems. So sometimes it can be very difficult. You say, hey, this is going on. Ooh, it's a major contract. It's a major supplier. Can't just get rid of them. What do I do, right? And how do I mitigate the risk? And what does that look like? Or do I just accept it? Do I just say, well, if we get fined $12 million, we get fined $12 million. And there's another really good literature on that called basically the idea that it's a sheep in wolf's clothing, right? So a lot of times these governance issues, they're a sheep in wolf's clothing, mean they look big, bad, and scary, but they're really harmless, right? Oh, McDonald's got fined $12 million. Who cares? $12 million is a drop in the bucket for us, rather than trying to rework our whole supply network and fix all these issues. And I'm calling McDonald's out particularly because I know there were some tax evasion issues in Luxembourg that were to the tune of 10 to 12 million. And so for them, it was, hey, we'll just pay it out, okay, fine, let's move on. And so some firms respond with acceptance and just say, okay, fine, let's move forward. So I have some more slides, but I know we're kind of getting deep into the conversation. I want to leave time for questions. So this is probably a good slide to end it on. I have a discussion slide as well, but Tiffany, I don't want to take up too much of the bandwidth here talking. And I've seen a lot of comments pop up, so I'm really curious to hear what folks are asking.
Yeah, we have about 7 questions in the queue, so we can switch over into that real quick if you're ready. So my colleague, Patty Whitcomb, will be joining me for everyone that's online going back and forth with questions here. So the first one we got is, are we talking about contracted supply chains or owned supply chains? And is there a difference when we look at sustainability risk?
Right. So this would all be contracted, right? So if you're vertically coordinating and you have control over subsidiaries or owned MNCs, then that would still be considered sustainability risk that is endemic to the firm. So if I have a multinational corporation and an overseas subsidiary, that's still part of my firm. Even if it's branded differently, that wouldn't be considered a supplier that's contracted. It would still be considered a within spillover, legitimacy spillover, and a traditional sustainability risk. And there's actually a really nice big body of literature on that in the strategy and entrepreneurship realm, talking about how do we manage the complexities of multinational corporations and enterprises and dealing with subsidiaries. Really rich body of literature. And so I'm not talking about those here per se. Actually, it's funny, whoever asked this question, because the reason I know so much about this literature is this is what we tapped into to migrate something that we call institutional distance, part of institutional theory, over from strategy and entrepreneurship into supply chain, which is the idea that the more institutionally distant or different a situation is from mine, the harder it is for me to understand the norms, the culture, and the governance structures and regulations. And doesn't that sound like something we live in every day, right? And the other side of that is psychological distance. And psychological distance is also really interesting. And we're using that in a recent paper that's under review or going back under review soon, which is this construal level theory, and the idea that the further away something is from what I can understand about it, the more the construals kick in and the more intangible or the more generalized it becomes, right? So if, for example, if you were to ask me, what are you going to eat for dinner tonight? I could probably tell you, oh yeah, I know what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. But the further out that question gets, the harder it is for me to understand and anticipate what my answer to that will be. So if you say, hey, 3 weeks from now, what are you going to have from dinner? I don't know. It's a Wednesday night. I don't know what I'm going to be feeling that night. I don't know where I'm going to be that night. I might be at home. I might not be. So all of a sudden it becomes more general. It becomes more abstract. And this is what we see in these decisions is talking to purchasing officers, procurement professionals, is as something gets further away, it becomes more abstract and generalized in the way they respond. So modern slavery all of a sudden becomes one big conglomerate thing when in reality it's very incident specific, right? Well, is it modern slavery because people are stuck in cages on fishing boats? Or is it modern slavery because you're holding someone's passport, ransom, and forcing them to work for you? Or is it modern slavery because it's wage theft? And, so what's going on within the situation kind of abstracts those construals because it becomes harder to focus on. So good question. I think I took it a bit further than it needed to go, but really good question. Yeah. So these are suppliers that are contracted, and not just the supply base, but all the way out to the nth tier. So this might be the 4th, 5th tier supplier. You might not even know who this is.
Hi, Andrew. Another question we have are, could you please discuss some impacts of COVID, both short-term and also long-lasting?
Yeah, that's a good question. So short-term, what we've seen is firms trying to respond to something that has not necessarily, maybe to some degree caught them off guard, but really changed the way in which we work. And something that probably was a bit overdue in some cases, right? In terms of remote workspace, in terms of how we engage, in terms of remote teams. There's actually a big body of literature on using these kinds of interfaces and mediums for communication. And only now firms have been sort of goaded or forced into performing in that manner or utilizing some of these tools. So that's sort of some of the short run. I see some benefits, some positives, some opportunities there. I think the challenges have kicked in where firms are trying to anticipate sort of the irrational consumer behaviors that exist. And I can't speak to this as well as my marketing colleagues and friends in downstream channel management can. But what I can tell you is when you're thinking about your consumer base, let's say you're Clorox and you're selling disinfectant and wipes and all these other Clorox products, and you know who your consumer base is. And maybe out of, let's say, 20 million people, or the 20 million or even 50 million person market for, let's say, hand sanitizer, you have 10 million. It's a pretty good chunk, 20% of the market. It's decent, right? You've kind of broken that law of diffusion of innovation. You're moving, you're hopefully gaining some traction. But now all of a sudden, a pandemic is hitting, and the other 250, 60, 70 million people in the United States have decided, just in the United States, we're not talking about globally, they're going to buy hand sanitizer. Your market's just blown up, and you don't know where they're going to go. Are they going to come to me? Can I anticipate 20% increase across my current 20% base? So am I going to maintain 20%? Am I going to jump to 30? Am I going to shrink? Either way, my numbers are going to jump. And so responding to that becomes incredibly critical when, one, you have now a rush of new consumers. Two, you don't know their spending habits. You don't know what they're going to purchase. You don't know the prepper mentalities that might exist, that clearly did exist for many people. And your current consumer base sees that, they freak out and they react, and then they start buying up all your products, right? So you have this really wicked problem now to solve. And it's really hard to fault these firms for making these decisions in terms of management. And even if they did anticipate properly, there's no way to say that their suppliers were able to react accordingly. And so many of the suppliers might not have been prepared or ready to react, or if they were, upstream, you're going to have a challenge. And it depends on your channel management. So if it's retail to wholesale to distributor to manufacturer, you can have a much bigger bullwhip effect as opposed to direct to consumer, direct to retail, or agents or things of that nature. So there's major short-run challenges that are still being disentangled, I think, within this complex phenomenon. So this is a major, very difficult, very challenging supply chain risk to manage. Now, in the long run, that's a good question. I think it just depends on how we manage this moving forward. I can't speak to the medical situation. I can't speak to the vaccination situation. I can't speak to the effectiveness of these things moving forward, other pandemics that could emerge. People have called this a black swan event, right? And the idea of a black swan is the Europeans only knew there were white swans until they visited Australia and surprised there were black swans. So the idea that something can't exist until you actually see it and then you realize, oh shoot, there it is. I would call this a dark gray swan because we've seen pandemics. We know they can occur. It's not a total surprise. Just the effects and the ramifications of this have been vastly different for the markets than we've seen in the past. So don't quote me on that either. I'm just kind of spitting that out there, but I'd say it's not quite a black swan event, but it's close. So hopefully in the future, we know how to react, but again, it could be a different disease. It could manifest itself differently. It could have worse repercussions, softer repercussions. Who knows who it affects more adversely than others? I can't speak to any of that. And so there's all these variables flying around that firms are that's what's keeping supply chain managers up at night, right? That's the question to ask, is what's keeping the supply chain managers up at night? And it's social risks. I think social sustainability related risks and these pandemic risks are probably what's keeping them up.
Well, and our next question kind of ties into the social risks a bit, where it's about consumer behavior and both how people can be informed consumers as they don't want to contribute to global, slavery and different issues like that, environmental degradation, but then also how folks that are in the supply chain and producing or selling these products, how they are also shifting to that. So are there some ways that people can approach this both to be more informed consumers, but then also on the flip side in businesses to also, kind of address some of those risks and those vague areas that you had touched on in your presentation?
This is a very good question and at least a 2-hour conversation. And I've had this conversation before, and I think it's a very good one. And it's really the question of, is this a sustainability pull or a push, right? So if we're looking at supply and we're looking at production and services, is this firms that are trying to build sustainability into their portfolio and pushing it out to their consumers? Or are these consumers that are pulling from these types of firms? And for the most part, what I've witnessed is it's the firms pushing. And it's not, unfortunately, with the exception of batch production, niche firms, and there are some firms that are doing some phenomenal things. There are consumers that have a really phenomenally positive, very sustainability-oriented mindset, and they work well with those small niche boutique firms in creating and generating those batch items that I think are really quite phenomenally derivative of complex sustainability issues. Now, the problem is when you blow out to the bigger production system, how green are these firms, right? How sustainable are they? Where are they engaging in what kinds of sustainability related activities? And the real challenge here is we've done some research and found that a lot of it is that consumers then drop off pretty quickly and many of them in the mass public tend to be not as sustainability oriented or minded. And this can be for multiple reasons. One, it could be they just don't care, right? Sad. I mean, it kind of stinks. But if people were just like, whatever, the world's on fire. It's great. It stinks, but I've met these people and it's really disheartening, but that's part of your market. Another part might be people who care and they want to help. They just don't know how, right? So they say, oh, I'd love to see a better world. I'd love to see a greener world, a more sustainable world. I don't know what I can do. I don't know where I can engage. I don't know where I can plug in. I don't know what to buy. Am I supporting the right firms? Where do I go? So that's, at least they're starting to have the right conversation in their mind, but they're not necessarily quite at the point where they've found full engagement. Another might be people who can't afford it. This is a major conversation I've had with folks before, is a lot of times sustainable products are not affordable. They're more expensive. And the reason is there's a greater expense that comes alongside engaging in sustainable practices, right? Good example that I always use is Patagonia, right? I love what Patagonia does. Patagonia actually had to go to Texas and develop sustainable suppliers in Texas, because nobody was growing sustainable cotton in the United States. Nobody. And the farmers weren't just people going, we don't care. They were going, we'd love to. There were plenty of farmers that wanted to do it. Too expensive, right? I'm going to have half the yield. I'm going to lose crop to insects, to fungicides, to other things. I'm going to get half the yield. I'm not going to be competitive with my neighbor, and I'm going to go out of business. And so Patagonia came in, they worked with them, they developed those suppliers and said, we'll pay those premiums to get the sustainable cotton. So sometimes firms really have to engage and work alongside those suppliers, but then they're providing a product at a premium cost or price. I mean, if you've ever shopped at Patagonia, it's not cheap. So there are many people who might really want to buy something from this firm, they just can't afford it. So there's many different levels of consumers, and I think not all of them are just trying to watch the world burn. It's just, can they afford it? Think about Walmart as well. You have many folks who shop at Walmart because it's the most affordable option, not because they hate the environment, but because, look, I'm on a tight budget. I'm sorry, I've got to get my 20-cent ramen noodle packs, or whatever it is. And there's no shame in that. I think I have a few in the cupboard as well, right? So there's things where, hey, I'm on a budget and this is what I can afford. And I'd love to buy sustainable, but that's where I think the conversation needs to move, is how do we develop these channels and these firms that can provide sustainable products at an affordable price? Because oftentimes there's a premium on many of the sustainable products, not all of them, but many of them. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but I think there's a pull from consumers, but unfortunately I don't feel that pull is as great as it needs to be yet. At least not in the United States. In other countries, I've seen a bit more. Some other countries, not as much. But it's hard for firms to push when there isn't a market. So firms could build up their cost structure, but if there's not an accepting, willing market to make the purchases, then they're just going to run themselves into the ground. And there's also one other piece of disheartening information. I probably shouldn't share this, but what we discovered is firms who engage in unsustainable supply practices, it doesn't matter if they get caught or not, they still outperform the firms that do, which stinks. But the whole point of that is they're paying lower prices, and even if they get caught, they just pay out the penalties. And so it makes more sense for especially many major firms, not necessarily to deliberately engage in unsustainable supplier practices, but to take on suppliers at lower bid who might then be discovered to have unsustainable practices. So good question. Yeah, we could keep going with that. That's a really big one. And that's the thing, is all these, let me encourage you, if you're a student and you're watching and someone wants you to get involved in a sustainable project or a sustainable anything, and you want to win this thing or you want to wow people, come up with something that's affordable and something that's accessible, because that's where it always falls flat, is it's never accessible and it's never affordable. I say never. It's almost never accessible and affordable. Make it accessible, make it affordable. I think that's a huge win for sustainability.
So now, based on what you've learned and garnered from other experts, when do you think we might get back on track or return to some sort of normal?
Yeah, again, I am unfortunately not a medical expert. I have a doctorate, but I'm not that kind of doctor. So I'm not going to provide any, I'm not a virologist. But the thing is, yeah, it's a really, again, I guess it's contingent on how firms decide to coordinate moving forward. So maybe the way I'll take this question is, because I think it is a good question, is in the direction of robustness and resilience, right? So I think what many firms have now come to question in their supply chains and their extent supply networks is, am I resilient enough? And the idea that we've pushed this lean literature hard and a long time and pretty hard, right? You have to be lean, Six Sigma, efficiency, effectiveness, maximization, and that's all good. There's nothing, it's not bad. I teach this stuff, right? It's very good. I mean, it's important, it's fundamental. But then on the other side, you can become too rigid, right? If you don't have enough setups, if you don't have enough responsiveness, if you can't respond and have dynamic capabilities for market needs, you're rigid and you can break really quickly. And so I think what firms are discovering is, how can I be both responsive and efficient at the same time? And we call this ambidexterity. So it's the idea of being ambidextrous, right? I want to be responsive, but I want to be efficient at the same time. And being nimble and ambidextrous is challenging because responsiveness comes at a cost. So responsiveness is not free, right? If I want to have more setups for manufacturing, or more services that I can offer, or more channels that I manage, there's costs on all of these items. And so as I become more responsive as a firm and I change we call it an order penetration point or a decoupling point, as I move that and shift that, I'm taking on or incurring greater cost to myself. So that's also that vertical coordination question earlier. As I coordinate more within my system, particularly within my own house or my own facility, then I have more control and I can be more responsive. But at the same time, there's then some efficiency questions. And there's ways to manage that with postponement strategy and all sorts of others. So there are ways to manage this and do it very wisely. It is challenging for firms. So I'm thinking, to answer your question, Patty, or that particular question, hopefully in the future now, firms are going to think, well, I need to be aware of this, and I need to have some level of responsiveness and agility and ambidexterity, because otherwise then if this hits again, okay, I have a digital online workforce now, but it might be a different disease. It might hit a different way. It's not going to transfer through the computer, hopefully. But, maybe this one, now if I touch something, I can get it, right? Because we know with COVID, again, I'm not a medical expert. I'm not claiming to be, it's more through viral content in the air, not as much exposure to contact. Maybe this next one is more contact. That might be a differentiation in shipping. All of a sudden, Amazon has a huge crisis. I don't know. And so how these things can manifest, there are very smart people at Amazon that are thinking about this, and they're saying, we are a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. If the next virus or bacteria is on contact, we have to be ready for this. So we need some systems in place to manage it. I was having a good conversation with someone. Actually, I like this question because the airlines, right? I've worked with folks. I worked in aerospace for many years. And, I worked at building out UAVs, drones, basically. Drones and VTOLs, vertical takeoff landing aircraft, and building out different kinds of catch and release fly for government contracting. Yeah, I know, right? It's like, who's the sustainability guy talking about working for the Department of Defense, building rockets, satellites, and spy surveillance equipment? This is a past life. It was interesting. And these major airlines, Boeing and Airbus not putting proper HEPA filtration in their aircraft, even before COVID, and you're thinking, people get sick all the time. There had to be some level of differentiation here that could have been leveraged if it was done properly, but it wasn't. And so I find that curious that there was no front running there. So maybe now in the future, firms will think, how can I front run this? Maybe.
Yeah, there's so many things that people are now going to have to do contingency planning around it and really dig into this quite a bit. We had one question real quick that was specific to your research about, are you looking into how different global practices kind of come into this, how factories are reacting in China versus US suppliers? I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that real quick before we kind of close out. And if there's anything else you want to cover before we wrap up here.
Yeah, that's a great, I tried to remove as much of my research from this as possible because I can get stuck in an endless loop talking about it. But to answer your question, we're working on 3 major projects right now. And those 3 projects are looking at this media resource, this media database of tens of thousands of media reports, and how these media reports have criticized firms for unsustainable supply practices. And we're using that data to build out a portfolio of risk and understand really what are the antecedents and the trigger mechanisms that lead to disruption, one, financial loss for buying firms, how long does it last, what does the window look like, and also what are the stakeholder reactions within the system. So really 2 research papers looking at that data and building out and understanding how that manifests. Another looking at reaction by purchasing executives and officers in terms of resurgence. So this one is, I find really interesting, is why do these issues resurge? Why do they reoccur? So if I used Nike as an example earlier, I'm not trying to beat on Nike here, but it's actually kind of the reason we started this project, is this huge criticism of Nike in the 90s. And Nike really did clean up their act. I mean, you can go to their website, they have a map of all their suppliers, they have a higher level of transparency, they're really tracking and tracing and using high-level software, Resolink, et cetera, to manage an extensive risk network. But still, because there's so many suppliers, there's issues creeping in. And so the question we asked is, and we used a tongue-in-cheek title we called Oops, We Did It Again, which is if you're from the 90s, right? Which is the idea of why are buying firms re-engaging in similar supply chain, sustainability-related supply chain issues? And why is that occurring? Why are these happening? Why are they resurfacing? What does that look like? And then the final paper is really all about modern slavery. It's disentangling what is modern slavery. We have a forensics. It's really cool because we've brought in folks from other disciplines that I would never have imagined working with, which is amazing. And not that like, oh, I don't want to work with these people. Just like, I didn't think they'd ever want to work with us. But we have a lady at University of Melbourne who's working with us, who is a phenomenal criminologist. And she's at Monash University, not Uni Melbourne. I work with a lot of Australian folks, so I apologize to my Australians. She's at Monash University, and she's a criminologist and forensic scientist, and she's helping us with the language and a lot of the laws and the rules and regulations, and why is this so confusing for purchasing managers, for procurement, in terms of disentangling modern slavery. And then we're looking at how are executives reacting? What are their responses to these issues? What do they do when they surface? And we found that, again, it's that construal level theory. It's that psychological distance of, hey, it's really far away from me, and so it's tough to disentangle. I don't know all the laws and rules in that country. I don't know the norms in that country. I don't fully understand. I mean, even in our own country, right? Norms and culture is different depending on where you are or who you're talking to. Think about a country that's thousands of miles away, right? And even in those countries, it's fragmented. So there's this huge level. There's a really good paper in Journal of Operations Management, 2017 on China. And these authors investigated the differences in institutional distance in China and said, even in China, there's uncertainty and differences in norms and cultures contingent on where you're located and who you're dealing with in China. Same with the US, but it's really fascinating, right? That even within a country, so that the people are just going, whoa, now what do I do, right? You're telling me this country is 2,000 miles away, 3,000 miles away. I don't fully understand what I thought were the norms and the culture. Now you're telling me it could be different depending on who you're dealing with. No chance, right? And so this is maybe to answer this question, I hope I answered it to some degree, is where it's incredibly challenging for managers. And this is the research that we're looking at, is trying to help purchasing officers and procurement make these decisions moving forward. And what do those look like? How do we write better? We have the California Transparency Act in 2012. We have the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, 2016, 2017. Is this language helpful? Is it not helpful? How do we interpret it? How can it be improved? How can we help managers make decisions? And this is what we're going for.
Well, and it's a very heavy topic, but thank you so much for sharing all of the different kind of layers to this, especially when it's something that we all are kind of in these supply chains, in these systems ourselves, as consumers, as members of organizations, as people, actors within this. So again, Professor Kach, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and research with us on supply chains and all of the different factors that impact and intersect with them. For those of you who are online with us, please continue to tune into WooStream and check out our other Willamette content. We appreciate you taking the time to engage with us in this conversation this evening, and we hope you all are staying healthy and safe, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you again, Dr. Kach.
Thank you so much, Tiffany and Patty. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone else who joined in. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me via email or otherwise, and I'll be happy to try to field whatever questions you might have to the best of my abilities. I might not have, especially the COVID related questions, some of that's, I'm not as much of an expert, but I'll try.
Yeah. Well, and we can also connect them with some of our public health folks. So if anyone does have questions, we're happy to help you get the information that you need. So again, we'll sign off here, but thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.